Welcome to Sound Beginnings, the Sound Birth Services podcast. I'm your host, Pamela Tessman, mother of two, an international board-certified lactation consultant, childbirth educator, and former doula and early childhood educator. I've spent 20 years supporting families, and I'm here to share insights, tips, and stories about childbirth and infant feeding. Whether you're expecting your first baby, navigating infant feeding, or you're a perinatal professional adding to your skills and knowledge, this podcast is your trusted resource for expert, evidence-based advice and heartfelt conversations, empowering you with the knowledge and confidence to nurture your growing family. Be sure to follow me on social media at Soundbirths, or connect with me at my website at soundbirths.ca. Let's get started. In today's episode, we're talking about something almost every new parent has struggled with, infant sleep. Whether it's sleepless nights, short naps, or trying to figure out the right approach, sleep challenges can really feel overwhelming and isolating. So today I'm chatting with infant sleep expert Cayla Solomon of Sleeping Beauties. She is dedicated to empowering individuals and families to achieve better sleep and well-being through holistic, personalized solutions. By addressing the root causes of sleep disruptions and considering the broader family dynamics, Cayla provides unbiased support and education, ensuring her clients feel confident in choosing sleep strategies that truly meet their unique needs and fit seamlessly into their lives. Welcome, Cayla. I'm so glad you're here today.
Thanks for having me.
I had met you like 10 years ago.
You know what? I say that about myself. Like there wasn't really anybody doing the holistic side of sleep even when I had my first kids. And that's sort of how I fell into it, was realizing that there was this need because everybody talks only about sleep training.
It's true. Yeah. And you must cringe when you hear the word sleep training too.
It's like a bit of like a PTSD kind of reaction because I did sleep train my first. Yeah. So I understand where parents are coming from. I get why they feel that that's the only option. But if I do my job correctly, parents will learn that they need to trust their instincts more and not necessarily feel like that's the only option that's available to them.
Right. And so your journey to becoming a holistic sleep specialist was kind of birthed from your own experiences?
Very much so. Yeah. So my oldest is 10. And when she was about, I would say around the 6-month mark, we were kind of told good parents sleep train and bad or lazy parents do nothing, because this is an important skill that you have to teach your children. And we knew that being responsive parents was really important to us, even though that was a term that nobody really talked about 10 years ago. Like social media obviously wasn't what it is today. And so there wasn't access really beyond your physical circle of people that are around you to find other strategies. And so we went down the road of sleep training with her. We found somebody who initially said they were going to be, gentle and responsive, but it was very quickly turning into just full on sleep training. And it got to a point where we were either lying to the sleep consultant who we were paying about what we were doing or going against our instincts as parents. And so eventually we parted ways. And I think I was about maybe 4 months pregnant with my second, sleeping on my oldest's floor because I was told that if I bed shared with her, it was this awful thing that I was going to do. And so the solution was just like, be close because I knew I should, but not close enough that I was like inhibiting her ability to quote unquote self-soothe. And that's when I found my way into this more holistic, responsive world of sleep. And I've kind of never looked back since then.
That's amazing. Very cool.
Yeah.
And you've got quite a background in psychology, is that right? Or
I do, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And that, I'm sure, just broadens what you can offer to families.
For sure. I think that there's a lack of understanding that so much about what we're talking about sleep is actually really about parenting. And parenting stems from understanding like what is developmentally appropriate for a child. And so you really need to draw on what we understand about developmental psychology and attachment theory to build solutions at night that meet the same parenting goals you have during the day. And I think there's a bit of a disconnect for a lot of people where they're very responsive to their kids during the day. They would never think of leaving them alone to cry during the day. And then the clock strikes 7 p.m. and all of a sudden it's like a completely different parenting strategy. And it might make sense in our heads, but it doesn't really make any sense to our kids who are not, developmentally aware enough to understand that sleep is being treated differently. And so we have to sort of bring all that together to explain to parents that parenting is a 24-hour job. So whatever your strategies are during the day, let's find creative ways of using the same things at night where we can still set, age appropriate boundaries, but do it through this way of, being responsive and making sure that we're meeting our children's needs.
Amazing. I love that. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, to like be consistent in your parenting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
With getting everybody's needs met too, right? 'Cause it's not, we're supporting the family as a unit and not just the baby.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So what does holistic personalized solutions mean in the context of your work? And why do you feel this approach is essential for sleep coaching?
It's a great question. So I would say it's kind of two big things. One is the sort of customization of what decisions we're making in each individual household. And one of the many issues that I take with sleep training is that it's very much one size fits all. And so if you have a specific formula or method that you're trying to apply to a child who's not a robot and they don't perform as you expect them to perform, we're told that the parents have failed at this task of teaching their children to sleep. And so for me, it's really about thinking about outside the box and coming up with strategies that work in each individual household with each individual child. And even within a household, the strategies might look different depending on different children that we're working with. Not every child's going to have the same needs. And recognizing how temperament plays a role in sleep needs, both in terms of how a child needs support to fall asleep and also how much sleep they actually need. That's going to structure, what our strategies are going to look like. But I think before we even get into what the sleep specific strategies look like, we have to look at sleep from a holistic perspective and realize that we're treating the whole person. So there's a whole host of potential underlying issues that could be manifesting themselves as sleep challenges, that if we don't identify them and address them, we can change the sleep structures a million times and nothing's going to stick because it's not necessarily a sleep problem. It might be something else. And so being able to look at the connection between different areas of health and wellness and how that impacts sleep and well-being helps us to identify like what is actually going on here. Which part of this do we need to address first? And once we address it, what are we left with that needs to be addressed? It's not always as cut and dry as like, it's just the schedule or it's just the wake windows or the environment. We're talking about treating this person as a whole.
Right. Yeah. We're all individuals.
Yeah. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And so how do you ensure that each family's unique needs and dynamics are incorporated into your sleep strategies?
So I would say the first way that I start with that, and I always warn my clients in advance, my intake form that I have them complete is very, very thorough. I'm like a little bit type A. I like to have all of my data up front. And so I start with asking a lot of questions, not just about, what does sleep look like right now, but what's the family history around sleep? Are either of the parents, quote unquote, bad sleepers? What was the birth experience like? How could that potentially be impacting sleep? What do the dynamics look like in the household? Even so far as talking to the parents about how they were raised, because again, if we're talking about parenting intentionally, we have to recognize what our own triggers are. And sometimes our triggers come from our childhood experiences. And so looking at what was each individual's experience and how is that impacting their parenting style is going to have a big impact on how we then manage issues with sleep, especially because for so many parents, sleep is incredibly triggering, right? You have this little person who is just screaming in your face and all you want to do is shut the door and walk away. And so it's a very triggering issue. And it's not always so easy to deal with in the moment because it's usually at the end of the day, you're tired, you just want the kids to go to bed. And we have to recognize how much of this is coming from the child versus how much of it's coming from the parent.
It's so true how it's triggering. Oh my gosh. That just you explaining all that just brought it back for me. I'm like, oh my God.
It's like a conflict of interest in a way because parenting and sleep together, it's like at the end of the day, our kids are recognizing that we're looking for the biggest piece of separation we're asking them for through their entire day. And so they're like pulling us in and saying, wait, I need this and I need that and I need one more hug and one more blah, blah, blah. And we're like, you people just need to go to sleep. Like it's been a long day. The end of the day needs to come. I need to just sit down and have nobody talk to me or touch me. And so it's this conflict of interest where they're pulling us in and we're pushing them away. And so it's kind of a bit of a dance that we have to do to find strategies, like you said before, that meet everybody's needs, that find that middle road to making sure that the appropriate boundaries are being set. And at the same time that everybody's getting the sleep that they need.
Mm-hmm. And so how do you determine the root causes of sleep disruptions for your clients? And are there any common root issues that you see? And did
Yeah,
they
it's a great
surprise the
question.
families?
I think the big things that surprise families are the potential for underlying issues, because it's not something that's talked about very much. And this is one of the challenges in sleep is, I would say, twofold. Number one, the sleep industry is not regulated in any way, which is an advantage in the sense that I could work with people all over the world. But the disadvantage is that you have people who can call themselves any kind of sleep expert, sleep coach, whatever, and don't necessarily have the right education. And so a lot of the times the sleep information parents get is very, very basic, and they're, spinning their wheels trying to apply these strategies, not recognizing that there's something else going on. And then at the same time, in most of the medical fields, sleep isn't actually taught. So, for example, pediatricians, they don't actually get any training on sleep in medical school. And so most of the information that's coming from pediatricians is more based on their own personal experiences and less so on actual medical data. And so a lot of the underlying issues that are common, for example, nutrient deficiencies or airway health issues or feeding related issues, they're often missed. And so parents are just told, well, like, you just have to leave them to cry. They need to learn to self-soothe, or, you're being a crutch for them. And that's not always the case. I mean, there's often situations where it's as straightforward as saying, okay, we need to get them on a schedule, or we need to be able to have certain sleep cues that they recognize. But in many cases, and I would say for most of the parents who find that sleep training either isn't for them or didn't work for them, it's because there's more to the story. And so I see a lot of cases where there are, more layers to what we're talking about, just because if it was as simple as just leaving them alone and walking away, people wouldn't be calling me. So I tend to see the more complicated cases. And that's where we get into those sort of underlying issues and overlap with other allied health practices.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you probably have an interdisciplinary practice then. You probably need to draw other professionals in. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
And so with your methods, you emphasize that you don't rely on one size fits all methods, which I love. I think that's so important. So your advice, what sets it apart from traditional sleep training approaches? So can we go into more detail?
Yes. So this is a question I get asked a lot when I'm speaking to somebody for the first time. They say to me, what do you actually do?
Yeah.
And it's a convoluted answer in the sense that I don't really know what I'm going to do until I see what I'm working with. And that's where the intake is so critical, because it's going to be a very different approach if I read an intake and I see that, there was birth trauma and there's signs of airway health issues and there's potentially nutrient deficiencies and the schedule is a disaster, right? It's like, which piece do you start working with first? So it's really about triaging what's going on and figuring out what is the most impactful thing that's having an impact on the sleep right now, and starting from there. And then once we sort of figure out what our strategy is and which direction we need to go in first, again, it's very much like creative thinking, outside the box thinking. So parents will say, well, don't you have a specific method that I have to follow? Don't I have to do steps 1, 2, and 3? And usually the answer is no, because a big part of it is reducing stress for the whole family around sleep. That's number one, because that's a huge piece of it. Babies are little stress detectors. And if the parents are stressed, right away, the baby's like, wait a minute, something's wrong. If something's wrong, I'm not going to go to sleep and separate from my parents. Right. I'm going to cling to them for dear life. Yeah. And so just being able to reduce the expectations around sleep and just making things a little bit more reasonable for parents, that can have a huge impact. And once we start with that and we kind of see what's left over, where those challenges are arising, then we can say, okay, we're having false starts, for example, where the baby's waking up every 45 minutes to an hour in the first stretch of the night. That's a very clear-cut problem. And the solution is either the baby's overtired or they're undertired. And then we can come up with strategies depending on which it is. If we're having early morning rises, same thing. We know what causes early morning rises. But until we get to a point where we've eliminated all the other factors, the underlying issues, the family dynamic, the sleep environment, we won't really know which piece we have to move first. And then even once we do, it's a lot of trial and error. And so that's part of the reason when I talk to parents, I say, technically speaking, we could use a package of support in, let's say, 2 weeks or 4 weeks, but it's very rare that I actually do that. I'm really not a stickler for the timeline, because we have to see how a baby reacts before we can determine how long it's going to take us to fix the challenge, So a lot of the times it's like, here's the 5 things we're going to try. Let's see which ones work and which ones don't. And when we figure out which ones don't work, then we know which direction to go in next. So I never really have a clear-cut answer for parents as to what it is I'm going to do, because I really don't necessarily know until I start working with a family.
Yeah, I can understand that. That's really similar with my lactation practice, for sure.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, there's lots of little details that you have to explore. And so I guess it's just a matter of forming that base of lower stress, and then
Yeah.
you can build up on top of that. Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I think one of the other big challenges for a lot of parents, especially in this age of social media where information's just at our fingertips,
Oh,
is
yeah.
that the vast majority of information that you're going to search for on Google is based on traditional sleep training, which is not really in line with what's developmentally appropriate for babies, but also what's biologically appropriate to expect of them. So a lot of the typical, myths around sleep training are based on things that parents really shouldn't have to worry about because they're usually not true. And so a lot of the work that I do with families, especially with the really little babies and first time parents, is just the myth busting. It's basically saying to them, like, you actually might have a very normal sleeper and you just don't think you do because you've been told babies should be sleeping in longer stretches or that they should be able to put themselves to sleep. And sometimes it's not really reasonable to expect that of them. And so setting, reasonable expectations for parents about what is normal when it comes to infant sleep is a huge piece of the puzzle too.
Yeah. Unlearning.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
sometimes blocking out that family member that
Yes.
really wants to
Yes.
tell you how to put your baby to sleep.
Yes. 100%. For sure.
Yeah. Yeah. When a baby can't tell you, I think that's one of the most
Yeah.
frustrating pieces for a
Yeah.
parent.
Yeah.
And I think that goes along with everything else with learning to parent and having a newborn. Your baby is communicating with you in these new ways that maybe you're not familiar with.
Yeah.
And learning how to go with the flow and let go of control as a parent is such a new thing for so many people and
Yeah.
can be really challenging.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I often will say to people, like, you forget that when you bring that baby home, you're actually a stranger. They're a stranger to you. You don't know anything about this person yet. You are the expert. You know more than anybody else does because they're your child. But it's going to take time before you figure out who they are and how you guys work together. Like it's kind of like starting a new job. It's you might know what the work is that needs to be done, but you haven't really spent time with your colleagues yet to figure out what the dynamic is in the office. And it's the same thing when you bring a new baby home.
I love that analogy. So true. So how do you integrate other areas of life or paramedical factors into your assessments? And can you tell us how this has impacted a family's sleep journey?
For sure. So I would say one of the most common ones, which is the one I typically use as an example, because it's something that people sort of hear as a buzzword and don't really necessarily know how it impacts sleep, is when it comes down to tethered oral ties and airway health issues. So this is an issue that has a massive impact on sleep and frankly beyond. And so my job isn't to diagnose because I'm not trained to diagnose. My job is to say, here are the different red flags that I'm seeing on that intake form that I'm going to make you fill out. This is how they're connected to sleep. And now that we know that this is potentially something that's going on, here's who I'm going to refer you to. So when we're talking about tethered oral tissues, oftentimes it's only caught if there's a feeding issue. So if baby's falling off their weight curve or, mom's having issues with breastfeeding or even with bottle feeding, then sometimes it's caught early enough. The problem becomes when babies are not falling off their growth curve, but they're having issues like really noisy breathing, or when they're breastfeeding, they have milk spilling out of the corners of their mouth, or they're making a clicking noise because they're not getting a good latch, or they're taking in too much air and they're super gassy and that's what's keeping them up at night. Or because the tongue isn't in the appropriate position, it falls towards the back of the throat and impedes the airways. And that's the reason they're waking at night. So in a lot of instances, that's a huge piece of the puzzle, is figuring out, like, A, is this going on? B, is it at a point where we need to treat it? And C, who do we actually go to first? Because that's a big piece of it too, is do we start with doing a tongue tie release? Do we start with doing body work? Do we do some myofunctional therapy? And so that's where there's a lot of overlap between my practice and people like osteopaths and chiropractors and dentists and OTs and physiotherapists and so on and so forth, because it isn't such a simple thing to say, okay, you're going to go to this one person and they're going to solve your problem, because everybody has their own area of expertise. So I'm kind of like the bird's eye view in a sense, to say, these are the symptoms, these are the different directions you're going to go in, and then sort of help the family navigate how that's impacting their sleep.
And then the families have that one person who's kind of walking them through that journey, right? And having somebody to connect with. Yeah. I see a lot of tethered oral tissues in my practice too, and the sleep piece and the reflux piece. And And
Yeah.
when you mentioned, a baby is still thriving, but it gets missed because they're thriving, that's so frustrating for parents because they're like, why was this missed?
Yeah.
I've been coming to my care provider with these
Yeah.
concerns and I get brushed off like that's normal and your baby's
Yeah.
gaining weight. I
Yeah.
always say the floor of what we're going for is that baby's gaining weight.
Right.
But we want to go to the ceiling, which is,
Yeah.
good sleep, good eating, like
Yeah.
everything is going smoothly.
Yeah. And I think that's also where there's a challenge with sort of saying to parents, the advice you're getting from your pediatrician might not be the best advice for your baby, because they're often told, colic is a diagnosis, which it's not. It's really more of a symptom. And it's just a period in time. And if you just kind of like bide your time and get through it, everything's going to be fine. But it's actually your baby like ringing a bell saying, hey, there's something else going on. We need to dig a little bit deeper. And that's again where I say to parents, like, you are the expert on your child. There's nobody in this world who knows your child better than you do. Absolutely. And you have that instinct for a reason and you need to lean into it. So if you have a provider who tells you, oh, don't worry about X, Y, or Z, and you in your gut know that there's something going on, don't be afraid to be pushy. Like, that's what your job is. Your job is to advocate for your child. And so if you think that the answer you're getting is not really sufficient, don't be afraid to go back 2, 3, 4 times or find a different provider who can listen to you and help you navigate whatever's going on.
I think that's really great advice because it's not just about the baby, it's also about the parent's mental health too. And that is a risk when feeding and sleeping is not going well. That's so tough.
Yeah, completely agree. And that's again where I find the way that sleep training is used is a bit sinister in a way, because parents are told like sleep training is good for your own mental health, right? If your baby's not sleeping, you're not going to be sleeping. And so you better just sleep train them, because then you'll be able to sleep and be functional during the day. And in some cases, maybe that's true. Everybody has to make their own decision about what's going to work best in their house. But I think it's actually a bit of a Band-Aid solution, rather than actually addressing why the parental mental health is challenging. Like, we're missing a lot of these, postpartum mood disorders because we're saying, oh, it's just your baby's fault. Your baby's not sleeping. And so that's why you're struggling. So there is often a need to say, yes, that could be one piece of the puzzle, but what else is going on? How else can we support you and make sure that we're treating you as a whole person as well?
Yeah, so important. So what challenges do families typically face when it comes to sleep? How do you help them navigate the challenges with confidence?
Yeah. So I think once we sort of get through the part of looking at the potential underlying issues, and those can be varied, and that's sort of step number one, is figuring out, are any of these factors potentially influencing what's going on? I think the next biggest thing is figuring out who the baby is as a sleeper. And this is where parents get really lost sometimes, because you can Google, a sleep chart for infants, and it's going to say your infant should be sleeping 14 to 17 hours in a 24-hour period. That's a really wide range. And so in a lot of cases, parents are like just trying to fit their kids into this box, not recognizing that maybe they're a higher sleep needs baby or a lower sleep needs baby. And I see a lot of low sleep needs children who the parents are like, they just won't nap. I do everything. I spend hours trying to get them to nap. And when I look at a few days of sleep logs, I'm like, well, wait a minute, they're probably not actually tired yet. And so a lot of the times it's just tweaking the schedule and playing around with the expectations and saying, you know what, maybe a 45-minute nap is actually all your child needs. And if you set that as your reasonable expectation, it's going to take a lot of pressure off of you, and they're more likely to thrive too. So really understanding how there's this overlap between temperament and sleep needs is really critical. Typically speaking, I would say, the really chill, super easygoing babies, those are the ones who A, are typically higher sleep needs, and B, tend to sleep better on their own naturally. And the ones who are a little bit more highly sensitive, they're sort of like, your orchid children, the ones who need very specific love and they need specific things done in a specific way. Those are the ones that tend to be a little bit lower sleep needs and more of your, like FOMO kids. So, you're not going to be able to take them for a nap in the stroller in the mall because there's too many things for them to look at. And recognizing how that temperament plays a role in their sleep needs will have a big impact on just reducing your stress around what your expectations are when it comes to sleep. So I think in a lot of cases, it's just helping parents learn who their children are and then creating plans around what we figure out.
I have both of those children. My oldest was the chill baby, and I was like, I'm such a good mom.
Yes.
And then I had my second, and turns out he's neurodivergent, right? So
is mine.
And that's all part of like the sleep issue too, I'm sure, which is runs in the family, and it can be really tricky. Yeah. You're learning whole new strategies. Yeah.
Well, and that's why I said before, like even within the same household, the strategies aren't necessarily going to be the same, because if you have two completely different children, their sleep needs are going to differ. The strategies you need to use are going to differ. And we can't put them into this box and say, well, your sibling did this, so you're going to do the same thing. It just doesn't really work that way. The neurodivergent thing is actually really interesting too. And there's a lot of overlap between that and the airway health component, because there's a lot of misdiagnosis of airway health issues that then present in behavioral ways as a child gets older. And so the children are misdiagnosed with things like ADHD, for example, but really what's going on is maybe they have sleep apnea. And so because their sleep quality is so low, they're just like a disaster during the day. And so there is a lot of sort of playing around with the different factors to figure out like which pieces of this individual are impacting these particular factors.
Right.
So I see a lot of that just because I have that in my house. I have 3 kids with ADHD, 2 of which have sleep disorders, which is part of the reason I got into the holistic side of sleep, because I have terrible sleepers. But a lot of people don't make that connection that like, if there is something behavioral during the day, how is that impacting things at night?
Yeah. My youngest had his tongue tie released when he was 11 months.
Okay.
And so we can kind of check that off the list of not being why he has ADHD. And then my oldest, he did have sleep disorders. But he was so chill that it kind of got missed. And like there was red flags for me before I became a lactation consultant. And then when I became a lactation consultant, I'm like, we need to fix this. And you're 12 now.
Yes. So, I'm literally navigating the exact same thing with both of my boys because it was missed.
Mm-hmm. And with lactation, it can be missed because it depends on the parent. So if the parent has breasts that are really good at passively feeding their baby, their baby's going to gain weight. But there's going to be other symptoms that are confusing. And it's such a wild ride.
And again, that's why it's so important to have these conversations, because there's so much overlap in what you do and what I do that if we don't sort of put those pieces together, nobody's going to find a solution for these parents.
No. And I don't know about you, but I find it difficult for people to even know about the services that are available in the community because the care providers often don't send them to pay out of pocket people.
Yes.
Which I completely understand, and I wish I was free.
I know.
I'm sure you wish that.
I get the same question all the time. Can I get you covered by insurance? And really, it would save the healthcare system a lot of money if we address some of these issues earlier on. But unfortunately, that's just not what's happening. But that's exactly right, is they just get missed because practitioners don't think to send them to an IBCLC or a sleep coach or whoever else. It's like, this must be behavioral. We'll just figure it out ourselves.
Stick a Band-Aid on it, like you said.
Exactly.
So how do you approach situations where parents have conflicting views or expectations about sleep strategies?
So that happens all the time. It's a very common thing. And it's usually the moms who are a little bit more in tune with what their baby's needs are, because they're the ones who typically spend more time with them. And the dads are a little bit better at sort of removing themselves from the emotional component. And so they're usually the ones that say, well, it's just going to be a few really bad nights of them crying and everything will be fine. So I think the education piece of it is really critical. Let's take the argument away from, dad wants this and mom wants that, to be able to say, what is reasonable to expect of your child at this particular developmental stage? And does that jive with what you're asking the child to do? So for example, if you have a child who's, super, super high needs, but you want them to literally put themselves to sleep, I'll say to the parents, what happens during the day? Will your child sit and play by themselves, or do you need to be right by their side? And they'll say, I need to be right by their side. So I'll say to them, listen, it's the same thing at night. So we have to figure out what is that middle road? How do we make sure that child's needs are being addressed, but at the same time, you feel confident in being able to say, I have the time that I need to myself. And that's usually what it comes down to, is parents feeling just really strapped for time and stressed, and they just want that alone time. And that's where the sleep becomes very challenging. It's often not an issue for nap time, but it comes to bedtime and parents are like, I just can't do this anymore. So it's really about identifying each individual's needs in that particular situation and then working backwards from there. So again, it's a lot of creative, outside the box thinking to come up with different strategies. And I think one of the things that sleep training misses, because it's so one size fits all, is how we can get creative. So for example, if you have a baby who you know needs to eat every 3 hours at night, rather than waiting until you get into bed at 10 o'clock and then sort of sitting there being like, do I go to sleep? They're going to wake up in 20 minutes. It's like that mental math. I'll say to them, great, let's start putting in a dream feed so that you know that you can feed them right before you go to bed. The first stretch of your own sleep should now be, let's say, 3 hours, and you're going to get a better stretch of sleep for yourself. Mm-hmm. So there are ways to sort of play around with what the child's needs are and still get the parent's needs to be met as well. But a lot of the times it's really just that educational piece and explaining to them like what you've read online or what your friends have told you about their babies. A lot of people lie about what's going on in their home because there's so much guilt associated with sleep. Yeah. And B, that's not the same child that you're parenting who's in front of you. So you really have to recognize the child that's in front of you.
Yeah, tricky.
Yeah. Yes.
I can see how parents may want to come see you for a quick fix and then be told, oh, we actually need to learn some things about our baby and try some strategies to see how it works. Yeah.
Yeah. That's also where I find, like, I offer a free discovery call before I actually work with people. And I find that that's a really good way to explain to people, like, this is what I do and this is not what I do, because there often is this, like, I need my child sleeping by Friday. Like, I can't do this anymore. I'm like at my wit's end. You got to get them sleeping by Friday. And so I am very upfront with people and say, listen, I don't make any guarantees because A, your child's not a robot. And so I can't predict how they're going to react to the changes we make. And B, this is not something that, it's not a problem that we have to fix today. This is a lifelong thing that we have to figure out what are your child's needs. So it's usually a bit of like an alarm bell for me if parents are like, I need this quick fix literally by tomorrow. I will often say to them, like, maybe this isn't the approach that you're ready for right now. Like, figure out what's going to work best in your family. And I'm more than happy to support you when that time comes. But I don't want to over promise and under deliver. I want you to be, you know, aware of the fact that this isn't something that we're just going to snap our fingers and everything's going to change.
Yeah. Super important to set expectations and sort of be able to get parents to wrap their heads around what they're looking at.
Yeah. I think also when you sort of compare what I'm doing to the more traditional sleep training, one thing that I find that's really helpful for parents to understand is when you look at the sleep study data from sleep trained babies, the parental reports report that the babies are sleeping better, but the actual actigraphy from the sleep studies show that they're still waking the same number of times. So what we're really doing with sleep training is basically teaching our kids that when they call, we're not going to come. And some people are totally fine with that. And if that works in your home, like, more power to you. It's not something that worked for me as a parent or as a professional. But I think for a lot of people, they think that they're actually teaching their child this skill. And so we just got to teach them and then everything's going to be fine. But sleep is a biological function. So like if I said to you right now, you have to fall asleep immediately, you can't do it because it's not within your conscious control. And so it's the same thing for babies and children. And when I present them with that data and say, look, like, you might be sleeping better, but their sleep is exactly the same. And they might be sitting up in their crib in the middle of the night because they can't sleep. Oftentimes parents are like, oh my God, I never really thought about that. Maybe I should look at the whole picture and figure out what's actually going on. And we address that before we try and make this, you know, rash judgment to say, we're just going to let them figure out on their own. Yeah.
And so what would you say to families who are hesitant to seek help for sleep issues because they feel it's just a phase?
It's a really good question. And I think it depends on each individual scenario, because in some instances, certain things are a phase. So for example, if your child's going through a big developmental leap, you know, they're learning to crawl, they're learning to sit, they're learning to walk, that actually could be a phase. And so if parents are reporting to me, like, in the last 10 days, sleep has gotten horrific. They were always a good sleeper, but all of a sudden something's happened and sleep's awful, I might actually say to them, call me again in 2 weeks. Let's see what happens, because sometimes that's all it is. And there isn't anything that you or I can do to change that. It's mostly the cases where it's been more long-term that I'll say, listen, like, you can wait if that's what you're comfortable doing, but we know that there's something going on. The quicker we solve it, the easier it's going to be to solve. And so let's figure out what that is, you know, like it's this conversation of, you don't really have to choose between the cry it out approach and the wait it out approach. There is this sort of middle road. And that's sort of where I live, is figuring out how do we avoid the things that don't feel good to you, but still actually make changes.
I think that's important to follow your heart too. And I tried a little bit of sleep training with my first two, and
Yeah.
a lot of us just say, and I've heard this from a lot of parents, that it's just like so hard on your heart and your instincts are telling you to go to your baby. And
Yeah.
I think it's really important to support parents in recognizing that and knowing that it's okay to go to your baby when you feel that,
100% agree. 100% agree. And again, I think that's where, when we talk about sleep training, it really is a larger conversation because I do work with people all over the world. I see the different cultural phenomenons when it comes to sleep, and it's a very Western approach. And it's if you look at the roots of sleep training, where it comes from, it's built off this economical need, right? Most of the sleep training approaches were designed by men who probably never did any real child rearing in their lives. And it comes from a time where there was a need to get women into the workforce. And so it was impossible to have a baby who is up all hours of the night and then have this mother who needs to go to a factory tomorrow to build munitions for the war, for example. So that's sort of where it started from. And I see it a lot with my American clients, because they're forced back to work so quickly. In Canada, we have long maternity leaves. It's much easier for parents to be a little bit more relaxed about things. But in certain countries where parents really are forced back to work, it feels like sleep training is the only option. And I really don't blame parents for feeling like they have to choose it, because it's not really of their own making. So I think as a society, we have to look at like what is going to be best long-term for families, for individuals, for children. And there are certain places that are kind of failing at that right now.
Yeah, we're a bit stuck.
Yeah.
Well, I'm really glad to have you advocating for families and spreading your word, because that's really important.
Yeah, I try. I always say to people, like, I know that I'm doing this for the money because it's my job, but if I'm doing my job correctly, I will basically put myself out of business, because parents will realize that they need to lean more into their instincts, and I won't really need to exist anymore. I mean, the sleep training industry is big enough that it probably won't happen, but that would mean that we've done our job right, is getting parents back to the basics of recognizing that they are the experts on their children.
What are some common myths about sleep training that you'd like to debunk?
That's a great question. Oh my God, there's so many.
Yeah.
I would say some of the most common ones are generally around feeding. So for example, there's this myth that when your baby hits 6 months or 15 pounds, they no longer need feeds at night. I always try and say to parents, I want you to take whatever theory you're talking about and extrapolate it to an adult situation. And if it sounds totally insane in an adult situation, it's probably crazy with a baby too. So it would be like saying to somebody, you weigh 150 pounds, so you get to eat 3 meals a day. But your friend down the street who weighs 200 pounds, they're only eating 1 meal a day because they don't need it. Right. It doesn't make any sense. So it's the same thing with babies. There's no specific weight or age where all of a sudden the feeding needs change. Yeah. It's really important to recognize that the feeding is supporting the sleep. So if you have a child who's like waking up, feeding, and immediately going back to sleep, technically they're sleeping through the night, right? They're waking up, attending to a need, and going immediately back to sleep. It's the same as an adult who wakes up in the middle of the night and needs a drink of water. You're not going to say to yourself, oh, it's midnight, I'm not allowed to have water right now. That's a crutch. I'm not going to do that. No, you're going to attend to the need that you have, and you're going to go back to sleep. So that's a really common one, is around the feeding piece and having to wean at a certain age, and especially in the context of breast milk versus formula. Oh, like formula fed babies don't need to eat as much, which is often true because they metabolize the formula slower. But if your child is waking and they're guzzling a bottle and then immediately going back to sleep, it's a pretty clear indication that hunger was a piece of the puzzle. So rather than saying to parents, just totally ignore the myth, I'll say, well, why don't we do a feeding log and look at what feeding looks like during the day? Because if your baby's, let's say, 6 months, it's very possible that they're really distracted during the day. And so they're not eating efficiently during the day, and they're basically reverse cycling and making up for it at night. And so that's where the wakes are coming from. So if we solve the issue during the day, the myth actually goes out the window, because we're going to help solve some of those problems at night. So the feeding myths are really, really common. I would say the other really big one that drives me absolutely bonkers is around sleep associations / habits. I don't call anything a bad habit when it comes to sleep. I don't buy into that. And again, think about an adult situation. So if your child needs white noise and a cuddle and you just stroke their hair to fall asleep, it's basically the same as you needing to do your skincare routine and getting into bed and flipping your pillow to the cold side and cuddling with your partner. there's no difference. Those are the associations you have with feeling comfortable enough and safe enough to go to sleep. So you're not creating this crutch for your child that you're supporting their needs. You're doing what they need in the moment. And there's nothing to say that down the road you can't change those things. So my advice to parents is generally, if it's working for you and it's working for your child, don't change it until it no longer works for you or no longer works for your child. So feeding to sleep is a really common one. Parents will say, like, it's so easy, it puts them to sleep, but I know it's a really bad habit, so I need to break it now so that I don't have to worry about it 6 or 8 months from now. No. If it's working, A, because it's biologically meant to work, but B, if you're enjoying that time with your child and it's getting them to go to sleep, talk to me again in 6 months when you're like touched out and don't want to do it anymore. First of all, it's probably more developmentally appropriate at that point to be able to make those changes, but it's working right now. So like, let's not fix what isn't broken.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you're speaking my language.
Good. Amazing.
I get asked that all the time. Is
All
it
the
okay
time.
to feed my baby to sleep?
Yes.
Yes. Very good for their,
it's like
their
your
mental
magic
health,
wand,
their
like
brain health. Their
yeah.
development. Yeah. And I think that comes from, some dentists tend to say, don't feed your baby to sleep because it rots their teeth, but that's been debunked too. So
yes, many times. I've shared that in my Instagram all the time, that yes, if you're talking about formula and you're like leaving your baby with a bottle of formula in their mouth all night, that's where that's going to come from.
Yes.
Breast milk doesn't do that.
Nope.
So you can feed your baby to sleep, like that's not something that you should worry about.
Yeah, and I like that you call it associations and not habits, because that puts a much more positive spin on it. I do the same thing. I need white noise. I need to snuggle up to my husband so that I feel warm. And why should that be different for our babies?
Yeah, like if those are things that we need as full-grown adults, like it's totally normal for a helpless, not yet fully developed person to need those things as well. And again, like if it's not, cramping your lifestyle, if it's something that you feel like you're capable of doing right now, do it until you get to a point where it's just not working anymore,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then make a change. Yeah.
I work with clients of all ages, like even adults. So I see these things all the time. It's never too late to make changes. So I'll have people call me with like a 6-year-old and say, I'm doing the same thing I was doing when he was 6 months old. I feel like I've broken him. I've ruined this. It's, it's my fault. And I'll say, no, like we just have to, now that he's 6, make age appropriate changes. Like you're never too late to change things.
Yes. When my youngest was about 3, well, he co-slept with us for a good 18 months. And then he moved into his brother's room and his crib and eventually his own bed. And from about, 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock in the morning, every night he would come into my bed for a snuggle, which I didn't mind. I loved it. And it did get to a point where it was like, okay, now I'm actually starting to get a little bit done with this. And I noticed that his feet and his hands were cold. And so I thought, I wonder if he's kicking his blankets off. Sure enough, he was. So I said to him one morning, I said, when you get cold at night, you can pull the blankets back up. He never came to my bed again.
That sounds very familiar.
It was just as simple as that. He was cold and he wanted to warm up, and that's where he thought he could warm up, was with us. And it's lovely and I miss it, but
it's funny that you use that as an example, because I literally just this week invested in a blow up mattress for my floor, because there are often nights where my middle one, who's like a notoriously horrific sleeper, he has sleep apnea. He's like, the only way I'm going to fall back asleep is in your bed. And he's 8. And I'm like, there's no room for 3 of us in the bed at this point. Like when you were little, I really didn't mind. So the new boundary is, if you feel like you can't sleep in your room for whatever reason, and you need to be close to us, no problem. It's just our bed is now off limits. So you are more than welcome to pull that mattress out and sleep on the floor. And that's the thing, is like, it doesn't really matter what age they are. You can set whatever those boundaries are at any point. It's really more about what is going to be that middle road between whatever your child's needs are and whatever your needs are. And that goes far beyond sleep. It's really for anything in parenting. Like, how would you problem solve during the day? It doesn't have to be as definitive at night. You problem solve in the exact same way. It's like we have to come to a compromise.
Yes. Yeah. And developmentally appropriate boundaries, like you say, and independence eventually, right?
Yes.
I think that's a worry for parents, is that their child will never become independent. And your baby's not going to want to sleep with you when they're 18.
100%. 100% agree. My oldest is a perfect example of this. She has always been a very anxious, like super attached kid, she's going to overnight camp for a month this summer by herself. Like it was like a switch flipped, you know? And I think that's the other big thing is we have this cultural idea that we have to teach our kids independence. But in reality, the way that they learn independence is through dependency on a primary caregiver. So the more dependent they are on you, the safer they're going to feel spreading their wings when they're ready, because they know that if they can't do it, you're going to catch them. And so you can't push them into that independence. It comes with time. And the most secure children are the ones whose parents supported them, not push them away.
Right. Makes a lot of sense. When we are looking ahead with Sleeping Beauties, what do you see evolving in the future?
It's a great question. It's sort of what we were talking about before we started recording. I think the biggest challenge right now is just getting information to the masses. And I think that's one thing that sleep training does very well, because it is so one size fits all. It's very easy to like sell a formula. And so it's this balance of figuring out, how can I help people customize what needs to be going on in their homes and still make services really accessible, especially in the financial climate that we're in, where, you know, these one-on-one services are so challenging for people, is figuring out a creative way to be available to more people and still be able to support my family at the same time. So if anybody listening has any really great ideas for that, I would love to hear them.
Balance.
But just being able to have that growth so that I can help more families. Like, that's why I do what I do, is I just want to help people avoid the situation I felt like I was in with my first, where I felt like I had no other option but to sleep train. But it's a bit of a delicate balance.
Yeah, and I imagine you felt pretty isolated, because I think that there's a lot of guilt around reaching out for help around those things, because
totally agree.
Us as parents, we just put so much pressure on ourselves to be perfect for our babies and know all the answers, and we don't. We need a village, we need a community, and reaching out is not a bad thing. You're supporting yourself in doing that.
Completely agree. Completely agree. Yeah.
And so are there any other services or resources on the horizon for you that you're building?
So I actually have a few free resources that if anybody's interested, I have a free guide to normal infant sleep, a free guide to sleep progressions, which sort of goes over everything from birth to 24 months. And then I also have a free toddler bedtime guide. So those are resources that I always offer, because I think it's a great way to sort of like dip your foot into the world of more responsive, holistic sleep. I have in the past done some group coaching, and I would love, love, love to get back into that. And I always say to people, if you know, financially, if it's too hard to afford the one-on-one services, if you can get 3 or 4 or 5 friends together, I am more than happy to do some group coaching for you so that we can get your questions answered, but also do it in a way that's going to be productive. And again, sort of to your point before, is this need to build community, because it's so isolating. So I would love to be able to do that. But for right now, I'm mostly focusing on the one-to-one services. And I actually have a certification in adolescent and adult sleep as well. So I'm basically anybody of any age, I'm more than happy to work with. And I find a lot of the time, I'll work with parents, we'll get their kids sleeping, and they'll call me 6 months later and say, okay, the babies are still doing really well, but I don't sleep. What do I do? And so that's part of the reason I did this other certification on adult sleep, so that I can really support the whole family.
Do you find the issues to be similar to their baby?
Very, very. There's actually a great case study. I'm working with a family so initially I started working with this woman. She has 3 kids. And she referred a new client to me. And when I asked the new client how she knew this other woman, she said, oh, she's my mother. And so I started working with the mother, who is the grandmother of these other children. And she has 10 children of her own. So it was a really great case study to look at like where the genetic component of these sleep issues come from, because I'm now working with 10 of her children plus her grandchildren. And then she ended up referring another one of her daughters to me. And so it was like 3 different branches of the same family. They all had the same issues.
No way.
Because there is a genetic component to it, especially with things like airway health and oral ties, because it's like, in a sense, almost like a birth defect, basically, where that frenulum isn't dissolving as much as it should. It's very common to see it among siblings. And I'll often say to parents, like, if I've said, I'm pretty sure this is what's going on with your baby, as I'm explaining to them, I'll say, pay attention to how many of these symptoms you have yourself, because oftentimes that's part of the problem is like, maybe mom is chronically iron deficient, and so she doesn't sleep very well. And then we find out the baby's iron deficient, and that's part of the sleep challenges.
Right.
So it's very often very similar issues in each generation of the family.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I see that with lactation as well. Once I, point out that their baby likely has a tongue tie, they're like, they do some exploring for themselves and they're like, oh, I have one and my dad has one. And
yes, exactly.
Yeah. And they didn't sleep very well or eat well, and they couldn't breastfeed.
Exactly. Oh, the grandparents all have sleep apnea. Yeah. I'm like, well, it's not real sleep apnea. It's probably a tongue tie.
Did you ever read that book, Breath?
Yes.
By James Nestor, I think. Yeah. One of my favorites. It's so good.
I'm actually reading another one that I just started yesterday that I can't put down, called Sleep, Drink, Breathe. Oh. Which talks all about the overlap between proper hydration, proper sleep, and proper breathing. So it's the same kind of thing, how there's this overlap between overall health and wellness and our ability to sleep and breathe correctly.
I'm going to have to pick that one up. What's the one message you'd like listeners to take away from this episode about prioritizing sleep for themselves and their families?
So I would say, number one, it's almost like a 3-part answer. Number one is reduce your expectations, because we're putting so much stress on ourselves that we have to do things a certain way that we're literally losing sleep over our kids' sleep problems. So the more you can just reduce that stress, the easier it is for your baby to drift off to sleep. So I very often say to parents, pop in your AirPods while you're putting your baby to sleep, because if your body feels really tense because you're stressed, your baby's going to feel that. And if you can just like listen to some music or a podcast, even if you're mentally not present, your body's going to relax enough that your child's going to fall asleep easier. So number one would be just do whatever you can to reduce the stress. Tip. Number two is don't be afraid to ask for help, whether it's from somebody like me or you, or whether it's just somebody in your village to say, I need a little bit of support. I need to take a nap today. Or can you help me cook some food because I just have too many things going on? So that there's that self-care element. And I think the term self-care in general is tossed around a little bit too much, where we think of it as like going to get our hair done or going for a manicure or whatever. I say to clients all the time, like, lock yourself in a closet for 20 minutes with your phone so that nobody can talk to you and nobody can touch you. And if you just need to like scroll TikTok just to like decompress, that is your self-care for today. So find, even if it's 5 or 10 minutes, and this is where in the bedtime routine, it's really helpful to get the secondary parent involved. Like have dad do bath time, for example, so that you have 10 minutes where you don't have to do anything. And just make sure you're like refilling your cup, even if it's just a little bit, because if you're scraping the bottom of the barrel, you're not going to be able to support your child's needs. And then I think the most important thing, which I think I've probably said 12 times already today, is trust your instincts. You know, you are the expert on your child. You know what's going to be best for them. If it doesn't feel right to you, it is not going to feel right to them. And the only person's opinion that matters in the middle of the night is the one who's actually getting up with the children in the middle of the night. So if you have, your mother-in-law in your ear or your friend down the street, like you can just nod and smile and then do whatever works for you, because their opinion really doesn't matter because they're not there at 3 a.m.
Yes. Great tips. Do you want to share how people can get in touch with you?
For sure. So I share a ton of free content on social media. The handle is the same for TikTok and Instagram. It's @official Sleeping Beauties. I offer a free discovery call if anybody is thinking about sleep help but is not necessarily ready to commit and has some questions. You can always book that on my website, which is sleepingbeauties.ca. And like I said, I have all these free resources, so please feel free to download them. I'm pretty good at responding to DMs too. So if you have a quick question about either a specific situation or what it's like to work with me, by all means, please DM me and I'll be happy to chat about how I can better support you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cayla. I wish you
Thanks for having
here.
me.
I would love to.
You know what? I don't need to, because I do work virtually, right? I work with anybody all over the world. That's actually another interesting thing that I see a lot as parents say, I want somebody to come into my house to help my child sleep. And my answer is, no, you don't, because then it's a stranger sitting in your child's bedroom. And what is that going to feel like to your child if a stranger is trying to get right? So my job is to coach you as an individual and help you figure out what's going to work best in your family. But again, you're the expert on your baby. You need to do what feels right to you, and you need to support your child.
All in caps. You're the expert.
Exactly.
Well, thanks, Cayla. Have a really wonderful day.
My pleasure.
I look forward to connecting with you more. it for today's episode of Sound Beginnings. A huge thank you to Cayla Solomon of Sleeping Beauties for joining us and sharing her invaluable wisdom about holistic sleep support and family well-being. If you're inspired to learn more about Cayla's approach or need personalized guidance, you can find her at sleepingbeauties.ca. As always, thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with anyone who could use a little extra sleep support in their life. Until next time, take care.